Welcome everyone to Gnosis Knockout Volume 3, where we've been talking about interviewing. Today's lesson is Interviewing 104, Conversation, Not Question. Now in our previous lessons, we've talked about the importance of research, treating our interviewee like a living, breathing human being and not a subject, and having the right question to inform our interviews. Today, we're going to be sort of rounding out a lot of that information into how our actual interview gets conducted. A lot of times when I see interviewers do their job, there seems to be this sort of script that they're very stuck on. They've got the 10 or 12 questions that they really want to ask, and no matter what their interviewee says, they're going to stick to that script. One of the problems with this is what we've talked about, especially in 102, which is that those interviews aren't an organic conversation. They're more like questionnaires, where you've just got, like I said, those 10 or 12 questions that you really want to tick off the boxes for, and then that's it. You're done. And even sometimes you'll see that they will occasionally refer to something the person just said before they lead into the next question, but there's not really any real flow sometimes between questions. This is something you really want to avoid because, like I brought up in 102, you really don't want your interviewee to feel like you're just using them for information. You want this to be as organic and natural for people as possible. Remember, especially those of you who are working in esports who have stumbled upon who this is sort of directed at, a lot of the people you work with aren't media trained and they don't do interviews. Sure, players like a double lift, a faker, let me think of a seagull, players like Surefor, players who have kind of been around the block have probably done a ton of interviews and they kind of understand how to play the game. However, when you're dealing with an up-and-coming player, they're not going to be very comfortable doing the interview unless they're naturally good at talking. And a way to bring out the most, no matter whether you're talking to a veteran or someone who's new, is to make sure that you're trying to keep it as much of an organic conversation as possible. Now, I want to reiterate something that I've said in previous episodes, or I guess lessons. I do not think that it's a bad idea to have pre-prepared questions. I don't think that having note cards are bad, and I don't think that having sort of a script in mind is necessarily a bad thing. However, sticking to it too closely can be a bad thing. And I'll give you guys an example. I've already used this one before, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth this time. So at EVO, when I spoke to No Kami after Dragon Ball FighterZ Top 8, he had mentioned that what got him into fighting games was the fact that he had injured his knee, and he could no longer compete on the football team that he was on in college. This is how the way he decided to redirect that energy was to dedicate a lot of time to Mortal Kombat. I believe Mortal Kombat 9 was the Mortal Kombat that he was playing at the time, which also led to him playing Persona, Arena, and I believe Guilty, and then eventually Dragon Ball FighterZ. Now, like I brought up in episode 3, my informed question that I wanted to sort of dictate all of my interviews was about your local scene and how it developed you as a player. However, once No Kami gave me this information, I threw everything out of the window and I focused on that. We talked about how he was able to channel that competitive drive, what it's like to lose the physicality of football, and I believe he was also doing MMA at the time and sort of getting that energy out too. I pivoted my whole interview to be about his injury and coping with his injury and how he used fighting games to do so. This was by far probably one of the greatest interviews I've ever done, and it's because there was a point that I could relate to, and I knew other people could relate to, and because I could relate to Kami, he was able to have an organic conversation with me. It really felt like I had just made a new friend, and I was just learning about his history. And that's something you really kind of want to try to target when you're having interviews. Remember, not everyone is a pro at being interviewed. And the best way to get the right information out of them is to make them feel like you're talking to them and that you want to have a real conversation with them. Doing this is how you're going to avoid those questionnaires, because organic conversations are the things that we remember. We notice when we're watching like a TV show or a movie or we're watching a play and the dialogue feels stiff because there's no real emotion put in, or we don't feel like there's a lot of acting happening. We as people are very good at being cued into what sounds fake. The same thing happens during our interviews. If we are not having a real conversation with our interviewee, not only will our audience tune in on it, but our interviewee is going to tune in on it, and we're not going to get a good interview. For example, some of you may have read my Knuckle Do interview. Well, I've done 2 other Knuckle Do interviews before that. One, pretty okay. One, not so much. And it's because there was no rapport between me and Knuckle Do. And I'm not saying that there was a rapport between us at EVO 2018, but because he was more used to seeing me around, and because I've also tried to have casual conversations with him at events that I had seen him at, it was much easier to talk to him this time around. It is extremely important that you make sure that you're trying to be as genuine as possible when you're talking to your interviewee. Make it very aware to them that you are having a conversation with them. This is something that we very much stressed in lesson 102 when we were talking about treating our interviewee like a person. Just because you have questions that you want to tackle, don't make the mistake of not listening to what your interviewee is saying when he's giving his answer. Sometimes you're going to need to deviate. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Your interview is not a questionnaire, and you don't need to stick to a sturdy script. Be flexible. That's what a conversation is. Make sure that when you're listening to the answers being given to you, that you find an organic way to continue the conversation. You can do both. You do not need to sacrifice the questions you've done in order to have an organic conversation. Conversely, just because you're having an organic conversation doesn't mean that you can't do the questions that you want to have. Both of them can work. When your interviewee is giving you an answer, receive it. Remember to have facial expressions, keep eye contact with them. And then, if you feel that there's a jump off point, jump off. But if you feel that a later question that you wanted to ask has been touched upon in a question that you weren't expecting it to get touched upon, just leap over to that. I like to tell people when they're making their questions to prepare for an interview to try to stick to small numbers of questions. A lot of times you're tempted to write every question that comes to mind. So you'll end up with like 10, 15, even 20 questions. One, remember that you're probably only going to get 5 to 10 minutes with your interviewee. Sometimes, and you'll have seen it, when you watch Travis Stafford or Born Free do an interview, that their interviews are much longer than 5 to 15 minutes. However, also remember that these two have a great rapport with their communities. Travis knows a lot of the pro players in League of Legends, and a lot of the pro players in League of Legends know Travis. A lot of people who compete in the FGC know who Born Free are, and they respect these people. That's how they're able to do and get away with doing a 30 to 40 minute interview. That's not to say that you can't get away with doing a 30 to 40 minute interview, but just be aware that especially if you're at something like LCS or OWL, the Overwatch League, or even something like ESL 1 New York or E-League, that you're not going to get 30 minutes with a player. So one, it's just good practice to make sure that when you're creating your questions, that you have 3 to 4 core questions that you want to talk about, that you're also okay with only one being answered. Sometimes you're going to start a conversation with a player and you're going to ask that first question, that first right question that you thought was going to guide everything that you talk about. And even though that question is great and the player gives you this great response, lightning strikes your brain and you just stick to wherever that lightning takes you. So let's remember that we're going to make less questions, not more. And the reason for this is that this allows us to kind of stick to an organic flow. We're going to allow ourselves to keep the ball rolling because when we get one answer, that's going to organically flow into another question, which is then going to flow into another question. And along the way, you'll probably hit those 2 to 3 other questions that you want to ask. Also, try to stick to a story. We talked about this in lesson 103, and I'm going to reiterate it here. We really don't want to have our interviews jump all over the place. We want to make sure that our interview has a story. And this is true whether you're doing a Q&A, a video, a podcast, if you're doing an interview to inform a feature. You want your interview to stick to a specific story so that, one, your interviewee doesn't have to think too much because you're sticking to one thing, so their brain is actively touching the same memory area. And two, so that your audience can kind of follow along and get a general sense of accomplishment when they're done reading the story. You don't want your interviewees or your audience to feel like you're all over the place and you're scrambled, because that's going to create sort of confusion in both parties, both your interviewee and your audience. So make sure to keep your questions to like 1 or 2 topics. Remember, all of this is to make sure that we're having organic conversations with our interviewee. Now, it's been fun doing this series, and tomorrow's going to be the end of interviewing. We're going to be talking about interviewing 105, which is going to be called the interview aftercare. What you do once the interview is all done. And this doesn't mean this isn't going to be about editing or, how you polish the questions. This is going to be what you do with your interviewee and their org once the interview is done, to make sure that there's understanding, to make sure that you have the ability to reach out. But remember, organic conversations and treating our interviewees like people is about 90% of the work of an interview. The other 10% is that research. But everything else is really just about having an organic conversation with the person that you're talking to, and remembering that they're a person just like you. Even if they're the greatest player in the world, even if you're talking to Uzi, he's still a person. He's not just the mad dog. Until next time, remember to go beyond and plus ultra, and I'll see you tomorrow for the end of interviewing.